Let's begin. We're going to start today with a critical look at critical thinking. I'm going to try and share some ideas with you based on 20 plus years of classroom experience. So hopefully this will be a useful session, and just thank you very much for attending. I know we're all busy, so I really appreciate your time. We'll start by looking at what is critical thinking and why is it important. Two questions that are often very important for us to understand. Uh, we'll then move into ELT books and we'll start looking at what do critical thinking tasks actually look like. We'll analyze and discuss some of those. We'll talk about why critical thinking can be challenging for our students and perhaps for us as teachers. And in the final part, which I'll spend the most time on, we'll talk about how we can facilitate critical thinking to help our students understand how to do it better, how to be more effective at critical thinking. So what is critical thinking? I'm going to start by asking your opinion. What is critical thinking? Maybe you could use the chat box to share some of your thoughts. Critical thinking is, what do you say? So some very good ideas coming in. I can see thinking outside the box, analyzing this, looking at things from different sides, trying to understand things analytically, and I'm sure all of those are right. I'm going to share with you three definitions. The first one is that critical thinking is thinking that is clear, logical, open-minded, and based on evidence. So this definition is telling us how we think, not why we think critically, but how we actually do it. We think in a clear, logical way. We try and be open-minded, and we base our thoughts on evidence. Here's a second definition. Critical thinking is the ability to think clearly about what to do, what to say, or what to believe. So here the focus is not so much on how we should think, but on why. Why are we critical thinking? In order to be able to do something in a better way, to say something or to believe something. And in this world of fake news, knowing what to believe is kind of important, I think. And here's a final definition. Critical thinking is thinking about an idea in a way that helps to understand, analyze, or judge it so that effective action can be taken. And this definition kind of combines those first two. It's telling us the way of thinking, why we're doing it, to understand, to analyze, or to judge, and the purpose of that thinking. So we're going to take some kind of effective action. So I think these are three ways that we can think about critical thinking, and they can help us to move forward with the rest of this webinar. Now, why is critical thinking important? Well, it's important because we use it in every aspect of our daily lives to some extent. And I think we could talk about many possibilities, but let me just share four with you. We use critical thinking at school, in the home, at work, of course, and even in society. If we think about critical thinking, we've got ideas like critical thinking can help us to communicate our ideas more effectively, to help others understand them. Critical thinking can help us to analyze or judge ideas and decide which one is the most effective or the most useful for us. Critical thinking can help us to develop better relationships, to maintain better relationships. It can help us make better choices based on evidence and things like that. So we know what critical thinking is, and we know to some extent why it's important. I'm curious what you think. What is critical thinking most important for? I'm going to ask you to answer and then to predict which choice will win. And this, of course, prediction task is a critical thinking exercise. So is it most important for doing well at school, most important for work, most important for being happy at home, and most important for being a productive member of society? Jessica's saying all of them. Of course, you're right, Jessica, but it wouldn't be a critical thinking task if I let you choose all of them. So everybody wanted to choose all four, and of course, you're right. One of the things I'll talk about later is that sometimes limiting the options or forcing people to choose one rather than all is actually in itself a good critical thinking task. And I'm sure that most of you suspected that being a productive member of society was likely to win, and that's probably because it's the broadest of those four categories, because school, college, work, home life are all part of society, of course. Let's move on. What do critical thinking tasks look like? In this next section, I'm going to share with you some examples of critical thinking tasks from National Geographic Learning textbooks, and we'll analyze them and talk about why they are critical thinking exercises. Here's the first one. We've got here a critical thinking exercise that is related to synthesis. See it up here. Okay. And when we synthesize, we're drawing together information from one or two or three or four different sources and trying to understand how they're similar and how they're different. And this exercise is, on the surface, fairly straightforward. What examples does Kukia give? This is, sorry, question one. What examples does Kukia give that illustrate how having more data allows us to see things more accurately? Question two is very similar. What examples does Kukia give? Blah, blah, blah. And these two questions look fairly straightforward because they're just finding an example. But there's a classification or categorization going on as well. We have to find examples that illustrate this or illustrate that. And that is a little bit of critical thinking. And then question three is asking students to apply the main idea of a lecture and the main idea of a video, a TED Talk, in fact, and to see how they are similar and how they are different, which I think is a very challenging critical thinking exercise, a very useful one for students. Here's a second critical thinking task. This one is asking about predicting. And it says Kukia begins his talk by discussing America's favorite pie. Discuss what type of pie you think this is and why he might have chosen to start his talk in this way. Well, America's favorite pie, I'm sure all of you know the answer. Feel free to type it in. Not going to be a very difficult question for our students, I would think. But the second question, why might he have chosen to start his talk in this way? That's getting students to think from somebody else's point of view, the point of view of a presenter, in fact, and perhaps getting them to think critically about how to do good presentations in a way that will engage the audience. So I think this is a nice little critical thinking task here. It's another critical thinking task, and this one gets students to analyze a graph or a chart, which I think is visual literacy is very important in the 21st century. A fairly straightforward exercise. We're asking students to imagine that they receive $10,000 and how would they use the money. So far, so typical. I mean, this is a very common exercise. But the next question says, on what three things would you spend the money? Excuse me, everyone, my telephone is going off at the moment. So on what three things would you spend the money? By forcing students to choose only three, we're getting them to do a little bit of evaluation of the different options and to decide the ones that they would like most. Because they're working with a partner, there's some consensus activity, there's some negotiation going on. Question two asks them to say how their ideas are similar to or different from the information in the chart. So again, a little bit of critical thinking going on there. Here's another critical thinking exercise from a textbook. And you notice here that we've got this box at the top that's actually giving some information about critical thinking. In this case, it's about deciding on different criteria when you're making a choice or a decision. And then the exercise is related to deciding on criteria. And it asks students to think of a decision, to brainstorm criteria that they would use to talk about it, and to decide those top 5 criteria. Again, an example of limiting what students do in order to make it a little bit more of a critical thinking challenge. So that's exercise E. And as I said, this is a critical thinking activity with this label telling students explicitly that it's critical thinking. But there's also exercise F. And this is not labeled as a critical thinking task. But if we look at it, we can see there's quite a lot of critical thinking that would be required. So with your partner, present your criteria to the class, but do not mention what situation you are making a decision about. Your classmates will try to infer the situation from your criteria. So inference is very, very important, very powerful critical thinking skill. So we can see that there's quite a lot going on here. I'm going to show you 3 more. This time I'm going to ask you to do some kind of critical thinking task. So here are 3 critical thinking exercises labeled 1, 2, 3. What I'd like you to do, please, is to decide which one requires the most critical thinking, which one requires the second most, and which one requires the least critical thinking. And Emily will helpfully pull up a poll. Please make your choice. So it looked like most of you were going for task 3, task 1, task 2, and I think it's our mistake. We should have told you which one was least and which one was most. I think we put them in an order that was perhaps slightly confusing. But let me share what I think with you. So for me, task 3 is the one that requires the least critical thinking. It's asking students to make a list of adjectives. Okay, not particularly difficult. It's asking them to think of adjectives that describe the work of an archaeologist. Well, they're having to put themselves in somebody else's shoes. They're having to understand a little bit about this concept of archaeology. And then they're having to categorize the words as positive or negative. So there's certainly some critical thinking involved, but it's not a huge amount. But it's labeled, clearly labeled, as a critical thinking task, asking students to categorize. What's the value of an exercise like this? It's critical thinking, but there's not a huge amount of critical thinking. And you may feel that that's not actually particularly valuable for your students. I would disagree. I would say that an exercise like this is actually very valuable. It's building some fundamental critical thinking skills like categorizing, like evaluating. And it's not particularly difficult, so students will feel some confidence, building their confidence at the ability to think critically. So I like this kind of activity, critical thinking light, I would call it. Very, very effective and quite quick and easy to go through as a teacher. Let's have a look at the second one. The second most, in my view, is exercise 2. There's some critical thinking going on. Students are having to listen to a conversation and explain something to somebody else. They're having to put themselves in somebody else's shoes to think how they would explain to somebody. But because students have actually just listened to a conversation about this, they were themselves in that position just a short time ago. So it shouldn't be too difficult for them to understand how to do that. Then they have to decide what information do they need to understand the concept of ecotourism better. A little bit more challenging to trying to think of something that you lack is quite difficult because, of course, you don't have it. You may not be able to conceptualize what it is that you need. But I think this is a good critical thinking task. And then exercise question 3, how could you find out the information you discussed? Not really a critical thinking exercise at all. We could make it one by asking students to rank perhaps 5 different sources of information as being from most useful to least useful, most reliable to least reliable, something like this. But as it stands, I would say this is a good critical thinking task, requires a fair amount of critical thinking, and it gets students to build those skills and build their confidence. And then, as most of you recognized, this one is the one that requires the most critical thinking, certainly in my opinion. Question 1 says to look at the photo. We didn't have space to show you the photo here, but again, this is visual literacy. We're trying to get students to look at a photograph and to make inferences. Who are the people? Well, we don't know that. We have to judge them from the actions that we can see they're doing, the clothes that they're wearing, the environment that they're in. Question 2 kind of gives away the first question by saying journalists, but it asks a very good critical thinking question. If journalists use their listening skills daily, what are some other jobs for which listening skills are very important? We're asking students to think about similarities, but perhaps not in a way that they've done before. And then finally, question 3, how would society improve if more people receive training in how to listen effectively? And you notice how this is getting broader and broader and broader. We start off with a photograph, we then talk about jobs, and then we talk about the whole of society. So a huge amount of critical thinking going on here. And if we quickly go back to the previous ones, notice how it says critical thinking here. And on this one, there's also a label for critical thinking. But on this final one, the one that requires the most critical thinking, let's wait for the slides to catch up with me. There's no label. It doesn't say that this is a critical thinking exercise. And this may seem unfair. There's a lot of critical thinking going on here, but students are not told that they have to do critical thinking. It's certainly going to be a challenging exercise. As teachers, we can tell them, look, you're going to do some critical thinking here if you want to, and then they build that confidence and they build that skill. Maybe you tell them ahead of time, maybe you tell them afterwards, maybe you don't tell them at all, but yet there's a lot of critical thinking going on here. So why can critical thinking be challenging for our students? We're not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think it's fairly obvious. Have a look at this poll, please. What problems do your students have when they're doing critical thinking? Is it a lack of interest in the topic? And Emily, I'm going to ask you to keep this poll up for a little bit longer than normal, okay? So do they lack interest in the topic? It may be just because the topic is not particularly interesting, or it may be because they've seen the topic so many times. We've all had that experience where you pick up textbooks published by different publishers and you open it up and you've opened it to a unit on the environment and then another book on the environment. And to some extent this is necessary. These are important topics that everybody needs to be able to talk about. But if you've seen them again and again, students may feel that they're just not that interested. Sometimes textbooks will do a topic that hasn't been covered often before. And in those cases, maybe students just don't understand the topic. Critical thinking tasks can be quite difficult. They can require language knowledge and skills that students may feel they don't have. Some students come from countries where critical thinking is not part of the normal school curriculum, and they might find it quite difficult. And then, of course, a lot of students feel that they don't have confidence when they're thinking critically. They're not quite sure how to do it. They're worried about whether they can do it accurately or correctly. They think there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it, and maybe they're doing it the wrong way. So I think all of those possibilities, and it looks like there's a fairly good mix, about 30% for the first 3 and sort of double that for the last one. And that certainly reflects my own experience. Still keeping this poll up if you could, Emily. How about as a teacher? For me personally, when I'm teaching critical thinking classes, I often worry that I'm not teaching it effectively because my students struggle to understand it. I run out of time when I'm teaching critical thinking tasks often because it takes longer than I expected it would. Um, and sometimes exercises in the textbook are quite difficult to teach, I find. Maybe in the chat box you could share some of your thoughts about, as a teacher, are there any challenges that you have when teaching critical thinking? Yuri suggesting a lack of interest in the topic. I'm not sure if that's his lack of interest or us, but yeah, could be. So some very good ideas coming in. Let's close this poll now. Thank you. So I can see from all the comments coming in that this is clearly something that is a problem for us, and that brings us to the next section. How can we facilitate critical thinking? We understand that there's a challenge for our students, perhaps even for ourselves as teachers. So what can we do to really help our students do better, think more critically, think more effectively when they are being critical? And I'm going to try and share with you some ideas. These ideas are based on my practical classroom experience. I've been teaching English since 1992, full-time since 1994. And I don't, it's not that I don't like the research, I just don't have much time to spend on research. But I do a lot of practical stuff, and I test things out in my classroom. So I'm going to share with you some things that have worked for me as a teacher, which I hope will work for you as well. I'm going to start with a quick challenge. What is this object? Type in your answers. And after you know what the object is, why is it relevant to critical thinking? It's like Jonathan was the first one with the correct answer. Of course it is, yes, a toolbox. Why is it relevant? Well, what I'm going to try and share with you today are some tools, some teaching tools that you can stick in your teaching toolbox and you can bring out whenever you need them if you've got a critical thinking class. And I deliberately did this kind of animation because it makes a little bit more critical thinking. Instead of just showing you a picture, your brain is having to process what are these stripes as they're coming in, and that makes it a little bit more of an exercise that requires a little bit more critical thinking. And of course, this is just a very simple PowerPoint animation that you could do in a few seconds. And the image comes from a great website called Pixabay that has royalty-free images that you can use. So if you wanted to have this kind of little game almost, this is something that perhaps you could do. And I'll come back to this idea of little games in a moment. So I'd like you to imagine this classroom situation. Does this seem familiar to you? Yes or no? Type away in the chat box, please. You have obviously a very attractive looking teacher in front of a blackboard. Work with a partner to do task H on page 9. Oh, and don't forget to use critical thinking. Have you said something like that before? Some no's, some yeses, some people saying never, obviously better teachers than me. I used to do this quite a lot. You know, I'd give them a task and I'd be like, oh yeah, this is critical thinking. Yeah, so come on, think critically. And when I had a really great group of students who knew what critical thinking was, who were willing to share ideas, it worked. But in many cases, it doesn't. Why? Why is this a challenge? Well, there's a couple of things, but I think it has a problem in that it assumes that critical thinking is a single activity. Think critically. And it assumes that there's a single outcome. Um, think critically and get the answer. And that can be a challenge for our students. And one of the things that I found over the years as I tried to become a better teacher with particularly with critical thinking tasks, one of the things I found was that teaching critical thinking as a process rather than as an activity was a very effective way to do that. So teaching critical thinking as a process rather than as an action or an outcome has a number of advantages. When we when we teach writing, we typically teach writing as a process, and we do that because it's better for our students. We teach them about analyzing the question, about genre analysis, about brainstorming, about outlining, about writing a draft, about revising the draft, writing a second draft, and so on. And we do that with reading. We teach them about skimming, about scanning, about inferring. In many cases, we teach skills as processes rather than as actions. And I think we can do that for critical thinking as well. And I can see from the comments that many of you are saying the same kind of thing. It's about critical thinking as a process rather than as an action. And this is not something that I've seen often or ever perhaps in sort of teacher development materials, but I think it's one that is obvious and simple, but very, very effective. So how could this work? If we've got a critical thinking activity, there are certain things we could do, and of course, there are many, many possibilities for this. But I'm going to share with you a very, very simple, a very basic process of critical thinking teaching. We might start by talking about what the final outcome might be of the exercise, and this final outcome is likely to be fairly general. If the task is about prediction, for example, the final outcome would be a list of predictions. We would then talk about the individual stages in the process. To get to that final outcome, what do we need to do? It's not just do it and get to the outcome. Let's break it down. Let's look at those individual stages. For example, if you're predicting, you might start by looking at how things used to be, get an understanding of the way things were. Then you might move on to looking at how things are now and compare the past with the present to give you an idea of what might then happen in the future. And I think that would be a possibility for this exercise. Are there any interim outcomes for those stages, for example? If we are doing this very simple exercise of predicting, if we start by looking at the past, what do we expect to get when we look at the past? Are we going to come up with a list of the way things were? How many of those things will we come up with? When we look at the present, what are we going to focus on? Are we coming up with a list of how things are now? Or are we looking for some changes, some developments, some trends? And then for the final outcome, what are we looking for there? And then you might want to look at language that students could use. Maybe there's some vocabulary, some lexis that students could use at those stages. Maybe there's some grammar that might be helpful for them to give them the confidence that they can talk about this. So we can break this down into these stages. Students know what to do at each stage. If we give them some useful language, we can help them to not just know what to do, but how to say it, how to use natural English to be able to give them this information. And of course, we can provide this information or we can elicit it from students. If you're using many textbooks, especially ones from National Geographic Learning, many textbooks will actually have a section at the back that gives you sort of useful classroom language. And sometimes if you're running out of time, this might be something that you can just show your students. Look, let's turn to page 200. Here's an example, I think from Pathways, that shows some examples of the kind of functional language and the two boxes on the left side of the screen there, getting clarification and agreeing, might be useful ones for everyday communication. All right. Or of course you could elicit it from students, write them up on the board, get some students to practice. Now, I think that this is useful because it gives us a couple of things. It gives our students some confidence. It gives us as teachers some ability to help our students. But let's have a look through some examples and see if we can talk about the stages here. So here's an exercise that we've already seen. It's about America's favorite pie. And yes, of course, that was apple. Although if you watch the TED Talk that this is based on, in fact, it's not apple, which is kind of interesting. But anyway, what are the stages here? Well, we've got several stages. The first stage, the overall stage, of course, is to find out what he talks about, the speaker, and why. Individual stages, students are going to discuss what kind of pie this is, fairly obvious. Second stage, they're going to discuss why he might have chosen, and the third stage is they're going to watch to confirm their ideas. So during that first stage, they're going to be expressing opinions. And for this, we might want some language of certainty, adjectives or adverbs of certainty or modals. So students are saying things like, I'm sure it is apple, or it must be apple, or I bet it's apple, something like that. In the second stage, where students are talking about why he might have chosen, modals of possibility would be a great thing for us to teach our students here. It could be, it might be, it may be, or expressing opinions, but not strong opinions. I think it could be, there's a chance that it is, in my view, it's possible that. So again, we're looking at this kind of language of possibility. So if we've got this very simple activity, we can teach it as a process. There's a challenge, there's a problem for us as teachers. And the problem, of course, is that if we teach critical thinking as a process like this, it's going to take a lot longer than if we just give the task. And your classroom situation may make that difficult. You may not have time for that. And I absolutely understand that. But this is something I've been doing for years. And I honestly can say that the advantages outweigh that disadvantage of it taking more time. Students get much better at critical thinking. They understand that this is not some horrible mountain they have to climb. It's just something that they can do as part of their natural classroom experience. And as students get more familiar with the idea that critical thinking can be a process with steps and stages, it becomes much faster to teach. You don't have to spend so much time going through those stages. Students will begin to do this automatically. You can flip the classroom and get students to tell you what those stages are, to talk you through it rather than having to tell them. And it can become a very, very effective teaching tool. And I find that students, when they begin to see that something like critical thinking is a process, they can apply that to other areas in their life and see that, in fact, many things that we have to do which seem challenging, if we break them down as a process, they can be easier to do, they can seem more achievable. And I think that's something that's very useful for us and hopefully very useful for our students. So to sum up, students benefit when we teach critical thinking as a process because they have more confidence. They know what to do and they know how to do it. And if we teach them useful language, they know how to say it as well. And then we benefit because we have this system that we can use to help scaffold any textbook exercise for critical thinking. It's really something we can just pull out of the toolbox. I've got a new class of students. Some of them are higher, some of them are lower. They don't seem very confident about critical thinking. Let's do it like this. We're going to give them that benefit. They're going to see that they can do it. We're going to have this excellent advantage. Let's move on. Here's another one. Does this seem familiar? Yes or no? You're teaching a class. You start off with the first stage, which should come soon. You do a warm-up activity. You do some vocabulary, some grammar, a bit of discussion, some listening, a bit of a discussion, some reading, a bit of a discussion, some critical thinking, and then you wrap up the class. This time I'm feeling a bit better because there's a lot more yeses than nos. So of course, right? I mean, this is how we stage our classes. You may not have quite as much discussion, you may have a few other things, but this is the typical staging, right? And it's very, very effective. That's why most of us do it. But is it the most effective thing for critical thinking? Sometimes, of course. Depends on the activity, depends on the situation. But I can see a couple of problems when it comes to critical thinking. The first one is that critical thinking is left until the end. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be, but if you're like me, you tend to leave those critical thinking exercises to the end because they're a little bit more difficult and we want to give students that scaffolding, that staging to get them to that point. And the textbooks will often do the same thing. They'll often put critical thinking towards the end of a unit for the same reason. So it sort of naturally critical thinking will often come towards the end of the class. And that means there just perhaps isn't enough time to really get into critical thinking. The second challenge is sort of related to the thing we've already talked about. It's that we're kind of treating critical thinking as something separate. We've done listening, we've done reading, we've done critical thinking. And I'm not sure if critical thinking is something separate. I mean, listening and reading clearly are different, but critical thinking applies to reading, it applies to listening, it applies to discussion. And I think that if we tell students now we're doing critical thinking, it suggests that they shouldn't be doing it at other times. And I'm not sure that that's the most effective thing for students. I think if they were to know that critical thinking is something they should be doing all the time, then perhaps they're going to find it easier. They're going to see it as something less challenging. So what can we do about this? I'm going to show you a way of thinking. And it's something that is about doing what I call micro critical thinking tasks. So we're doing smaller critical thinking tasks more often can be very beneficial. And you'll see at the top of the screen there, demand high teaching. That's something I typed in a short time before the session began. And yes, I see Claude is asking about Scrivener and Underhill. Yes, this is Jim Scrivener and Adrian Underhill, who gave a name to something that a lot of teachers do automatically, which is to challenge students at a level perhaps slightly above what they're used to, but yet definitely within their capabilities. Most of my classroom experience was in test preparation, IELTS and TOEFL and things like that. And I struggled, as perhaps some of you do, to really help my students get a better score. And although there's no critical thinking section in IELTS or TOEFL, it's underpinning everything they have to do when they're answering questions, when they're thinking, when they're reading, when they're listening, when they're writing, when they're speaking. And I found that doing these, what we now call demand high teaching tasks, was a very effective way to build those critical thinking skills to help students understand the challenge that they needed. And I was doing this for years and years and years. And then I read an article written by, I think by Jim Scrivener, about this thing called demand high teaching. And suddenly I was like, oh, that's what it's called. That's fantastic. I've been doing this and I know the name. And then I was like, oh, I've been doing this for years and they've only just named it. I could have named it. And I felt very disappointed that I'd missed that opportunity to name something and become famous. Oh well. So let's look at some examples of what these micro critical thinking tasks can be. One of the things you can do to add a little bit of critical thinking is you can change the perspective of a task. Typical exercise will ask students to give their opinion. What do you think? Fantastic. We want them to give their opinions, of course. But let's change it. Let's change the perspective. Instead of asking students to say what they think, ask them to say what a child would think, or a senior citizen, or perhaps somebody from a different country, or perhaps what their future self would think, or their past self would have thought. By changing the perspective, we're forcing students to think from a different point of view, and that is itself a critical thinking task. Second, this is not rocket science. You've done this many times, but we can ask open-ended information questions to get a little bit more critical thinking going on. We can ask students very, very simple questions. Why? Why do you think that? Of course. Why is it that way? Why is it not a different way? Why do many people think that? Why do some people think something different? Where? Where is the best place to do this? Is it always this place? Is it some other place? When? When should we do this? When should we not do this? Are there any times when it's not a good idea? Who? Who is most affected by this? Who is least affected by this? These are some very, very simple questions that we don't have to prepare as teachers necessarily. We can just come up with them on the spot. And this is definitely the kind of demand high aspect of this. And I think the ability to answer questions is a skill that many people are losing. I'm not going to mention any names, but you look at some politicians, they're not great at answering questions. You know, they're great at avoiding the question, but they're not very good at actually giving good answers. And I think if we can help our students with this skill, it's a very, very useful skill for the rest of their lives. And it requires some critical thinking as well. Another thing, and this is something I've talked about a little bit, is to limit situations or tasks. Rather than giving students this, we give them this. And that can be quite powerful. A good example here, a good analogy here, is Japanese haiku poetry. If any of you are familiar with Japanese haiku poetry, it has a very, very rigid structure. There must be 17 syllables in the pattern of 5 syllables, and then 7 syllables, and then 5 syllables. And that's it. You can't do anything different. 5, 7, 5. And that itself is very limiting. But that limitation can allow some incredible creativity because you're thinking in a different way than you normally think. If you've got unlimited syllables, there's a lot of things you can say. If you've got a very limited number of syllables, you have to do things differently. You have to think differently. And this is why I like this activity to introduce some micro-critical thinking. And then the final one that I'm going to give you, and of course there are hundreds of possibilities to add micro-critical thinking, but here are 4 that I often use that I think are quite helpful. The 4th one is to focus on similarities, how things are similar to something else. And of course, when we talk about similarities, we're not talking about the same. They are different slightly. So when we talk about similarities, we're automatically talking about slight differences as well. And there's a couple of ways you can do this. You can talk about literal similarities, means things that are literally similar to each other. I mean, a book and a magazine are quite similar because they're made of paper, they've got information, they've got pages. Those are literally similar. But we can also say a figurative, a metaphorical similarity. A book is like the internet because they've got lots of information that you can find, but of course there's differences there. And I think personally that this figurative one, where we get into metaphor or simile or analogy, that's really powerful for critical thinking. We can really get some interesting things going on, some interesting discussions, and really get students to understand something. There's a book I read. I'll type this in for you. I think the author is George Lakoff, and there's perhaps a second author, but the book is called Metaphors We Live By, and it's absolutely fascinating. It's also quite good for putting you to sleep if you're reading it late at night, but the actual information is really, really interesting. Have a look if you can find it. Just Google it online, and I'm sure you can see some pages. I can see some people saying the book is great. It's not great bedtime reading, but it is very, very interesting. And this is where I got this idea of looking for literal and figurative similarities. So to help you remember these, I've given you a little mnemonic. PALS. You can be pals with your students, change the perspective, ask open-ended questions, limit situations or tasks, and focus on similarities. Okay? So let's have a look at some examples of this in practice. How do we change the perspective? Here's an exercise from a textbook. And the question is saying, what was life like 5,000 years ago? How is modern life similar to life 5,000 years ago? And how is it different? So there's some critical thinking here. Students have to look for similarities and differences, of course. But let's change the perspective. Let's ask students to imagine that somebody from 5,000 years ago has magically been transported to the present day. What things are going to blow that person's mind? And what things are going to make them shrug and go, huh, yeah, seen it before? That is a slight different perspective that gets students to think in slightly different ways, because they're now thinking about a person's life. They're putting themselves in that person's shoes. So that's just a very simple example of how we could change the perspective. Let's ask questions. Here's an activity that asks students to think about protecting the environment and to decide which group of people are most likely or least likely to protect the environment. And just for the sake of argument, let's say that our students decided that celebrities were the ones least likely to protect the environment. Well, let's ask some questions. Why is that? Why are celebrities the ones least likely? Who? Is it all celebrities? Is it some celebrities? Is it celebrities that are in this industry, or is it in that industry? Who? Mainly women, mainly men. Where? In every country, in some countries. When? Is it true now? Did it used to be true? Just some very simple questions that we could ask to get our students to do a little bit more critical thinking. We can set limits. Here's an activity that asks students to look at a section from a script and to come up with the meaning of the word prototype. It's not a particularly high frequency word, but this exercise gets them to do a little bit of critical thinking, contextual analysis to try and understand vocabulary from context. Very, very useful. Okay, so a fairly straightforward exercise. Let's make it more challenging for students. Let's put limits on it. Let's say, tell me the meaning of the word prototype using only 6 words. Tell me the meaning of the word prototype without using the word thing. Tell me the meaning of the word prototype using a gerund. In this case, we can get students to think a little bit more critically, a little bit differently about this fairly simple activity. So this is something that I think could be quite useful if we're setting limits. And then finally, we focus on similarities. Here's a fairly simple exercise. Answer these questions, then discuss how many people gave the same answers as you. So how about this first question? Do you prefer taking photos of people or dramatic landscapes? Let's ask our students to say, how are landscapes like people? What similarities do we see between landscapes and people? And there's actually an interesting clue here. This word dramatic, of course, is a word that we use to describe people. This is not necessarily a word that describes a landscape. Do we talk about an angry sky? Do we talk about peaceful hills? Angry, peaceful, dramatic. These are adjectives that we actually use to describe people. So in itself, it's giving us this example. Look at question 2. It says, in addition to water and wind, what else might cause a landscape to erode? Well, let's ask our students to say how people are like water. We talk about a crowd of people flowing down the street. We talk about a flood of applications for a job. And these are all water words. And we can show students this similarity. And it's certainly not a literal similarity. It's definitely a figurative similarity. And this ability to master figurative language, I think, is a very, very useful 21st century skill, because it allows people to understand something very effectively. So hopefully this is a useful way for you to add in some micro critical thinking activities. One more. I promise this is the last one. Does this seem familiar? Yes or no? So, would anyone like to share their answers to the critical thinking task? Anyone? Someone, please? Okay, so lots of yeses, and we've been there. So students don't want to answer. Why? Lots of reasons. They're not confident, they're shy, they don't have ideas, blah blah blah. Lots of possibilities. How can we fix this? Well, like any kind of ELT activity, we can adapt. We can adapt critical thinking tasks so that they work better with your students. I mean, this is not rocket science, but I'm going to suggest 3 ways that I have found very, very useful, very interesting. The first one, when the slide comes, is to gamify. You can gamify tasks. Gamification is something that's becoming kind of interesting, becoming quite popular in learning, especially e-learning. And it's not about playing games. It's about using the elements of a game, the parts of a game, to make something more interesting without making it more difficult or more challenging. The second thing you can do is you can personalize, of course, you can localize, make it more personal for your students, make it more effective for your locality, your place where you are. And of course, finally, you can cherry pick. You can choose this task and this task, but not this one and not this one. Let's look at some examples. Here's one that we've already seen. How could we gamify this? The original tasks asked students to say 3 things that they would use, that they would buy with $10,000. Okay, so students say their 3 things. And each time they say something, you, as the teacher, assign some points. Okay, you get 50 points for this. Oh, you get 5 points for that. Oh, minus 20 for that. But don't say why. So students are having to listen. They're listening to each other. They're listening to you, and in their heads, they're trying to make a connection. Oh, well, that was 5 points, but that was minus 5, so that must mean this is better than this. And if they can guess your criteria, then they get bonus points. And at the end of the task, you say who got the most points, and you say what those criteria were. You've turned a very, very standard exercise into something that is quite interesting itself, because there's this inference activity going on. So I'm not going to say more about gamification. There's quite a lot of stuff out there. If you Google gamification in ELT, you'll find quite a lot of useful stuff. Okay. Here's another one. We've seen this activity before. Let's localize it. It's talking about America's favorite pie. Well, what if the speaker were from a different country? What pie, what food would the speaker talk about? Would that be a good way to do it? In America, apple pie is very well known. Would it be something other than food in different countries? So a very simple way to localize that. And here's an activity that we can cherry pick. There are 3 questions here. The first question is fairly straightforward and it's useful. It's getting students to reflect. The second question is asking students to think about something they lack, and that's quite difficult and it's quite time consuming. So maybe we skip question 2 and we skip question 3. They're not the most useful for us, for our students, perhaps, so we don't need to